This is the CitySites Podcast with Larry Kutzler.
Five things we hear growing up. 5 things society says to men who try to grow up. 1. Men don't cry because women have monopoly over the tears, because emotions are just another cover-up for weakness. Well, guess what? When Kevin failed in 5th grade, he didn't cry. When Kevin's mother left him, he didn't cry. When Kevin's girlfriend died, he didn't cry. When Kevin committed suicide, he wondered who would cry. 2. All men are dogs. They are animals, preying, looking for their next target, the next woman to lie, cheat, harass, or betray. Well, certainly, because 1 man or 2 or 20 lakh men is all it takes to define an entire gender. Because the loyalty, faithfulness, and everything wonderful that a man's best friend is shoved under the carpet because that one dog couldn't stop humping. 3. Be a man, said the father who was never there. Said the alcoholic uncle who couldn't stop staring at the blouse of his neighbor's daughter. Be a man. What an ideal to set for a 13-year-old boy who is shaving his non-existent mustache, who's experimenting with the protruding parts of his body, who is so awkward being around the members of the opposite sex, who is struggling to be a teenager in the first place. 4. Real men finish last. Because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. Your ability to stop your ability from doing its job. So hold it. Hold it tight. Masculinity is a word. Humanity is another. So are love, care, and compassion. So maybe if you, dear society, get over what the first one means to you, you'll see what the next few mean to the rest of us. 5. Men will be men. I say they should be. A man should be a man when he sheds his first tear, when he cries his eyes out. A man should be a man and not a dog or a pig or any other animal you could possibly generalize. A man should be a man when his father comes home drunk and raises his hand. A man should be a man when his daughter brings home a boy. A man should be a man when he's in bed with the woman he loves, cherishes, and appreciates. A man should be a man. And before everything else, a man is a human too. So don't get me wrong. I'm not here trying to change any definitions. This is me trying to fix the misconceptions, not for them, the society, but for me. So the day that I bring home a boy, my father shakes his hand and does not ask for the balance in his bank or what his father does for a living. This one is for all the young girls pretending they have no male friends because their fathers cannot stand the idea that his daughter is safe with them and from them. This one is for all the young men becoming predators, forgetting that they were victims first, victims of society's norms from the moment they were born. So don't get me wrong. This is not a debate about feminism or a million other isms. This is about unlearning years of conditioning and apathy, and instead learning about kindness and empathy. We need to liberate our souls from what it is to be a he or a she, and see what it is to be you and me. So this time, let's make it about humanity.
For the longest time, I always felt that men are the problem in society. I think they're the problem in marriages most of the time. There are problems in crime most of the time. I love what Jordan Peterson said here in an interview when he was trying to talk to journalists about the fact that men aren't the dominant factor in society. They often are very much the victims.
So that's my idea of the patriarchy, which is a system of male dominance of society.
Yeah, but that's not my sense of the patriarchy.
So what's yours?
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
Very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like Where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
So I decided to talk with someone that I felt had a good handle on men in society and the wounds that men carry in their lives. So my pastor, Pastor Walt McFadden, has been working with young men and men for quite a long time and has some insights that I do think you will enjoy what he has to say. Pastor Walt McFadden is my guest today on the CitySites Podcast. Pastor Walt, here's my assumption. Men have been emasculated for several decades, maybe forever, but for sure, since I was coming up, men seem to be less like men. Have you noticed that?
Oh, absolutely. The old song is, "It's a man's world." Mm-hmm. No, not anymore. This is not a man's world that we're living in.
I mean, I guess women can look like men and men look like women. But I see a whole lot more men wearing men buns, I think they call it, and clothes that are effeminate. Now, I realize that doesn't make a man, but I go, why? Why does someone want to be more effeminate or more maybe in the neutral area, halfway between the two genders? I don't know. What's your thoughts?
Well, the lines are definitely crossed, that's for sure. And I think that is a satanic strategy to confuse and to counterfeit what God has created. Men are looking for clear direction. They're very simple creatures, just a little bit of instruction and a little bit of help through life. Women are complicated creatures. They are created differently than men are. But if we can just give men a little bit of direction, and if they will receive that direction, things might straighten out a little bit. I have a lot of young men. I was making a list yesterday, and I was thinking about Jesus, his 1, 3, and 12. He had John, his most intimate, is 1. Then he had 3, Peter, James, and John. Then he had this 12. So I was making out my list, who is my 12? And I went way beyond the 12
really?
Of young men that I meet with regularly and invest in their life. And I think that's really what the church needs to do. It's a matter of discipleship. But then that is the problem, what I said, if a man will listen. And a lot of men don't listen. And they don't listen because they're wounded and they're hurting and they're carrying what I refer to, I've heard from others before. It's not a term that I invented, a father wound. They're hurt. Maybe not directly by their father, but they're hurt by other men, or they're hurt because they can't seem to grasp their identity and who they are. And identity in Christ is a common theme in churches. I hear it preached all the time. And it's rightly so. We do have our identity in Christ, but we carry those wounds oftentimes from our previous life into our new life in Christ, just like we do all habits. And we need to be humble and we need to be teachable. And I've had to deal with wounds in my life from my father. And I had a good relationship with my father, but my father was very passive, is very weak, and I began to walk in his shoes. The phrase is, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. Then I found myself doing a lot of things that my father did. So when I think about wound, you think right away, well, I was hurt. But it can be something around this kind of the same idea that we didn't really get what we needed from our father. And so then we need to get it from other men in the church, and we need to get it from Christ himself. Those are the two main sources of how we walk with other men and how we sort of renew this identity in the image of Christ.
So do you think that men that have this wound and this need, are they, rather than turning to other men, are they turning to women or girlfriends? Or I'm not sure why men are becoming more effeminate. I'm sure it's because of what you just said. There's a wound there, and they don't know who they are, and they're kind of searching. So what do you think is happening?
A number of things. They're getting false images. What I always teach in the church is what we're looking for is perfection. We're not going to get it, but there is a perfect man, and that's our Heavenly Father. And then there is his Son, Jesus Christ, who is the perfect Son. So we have this image, and it's our aim. But then the world puts before us all of these counterfeits, these distortions A really good example is pornography. Men learn and watch and develop an understanding of how women are that's false. Women are just not like that. It's acting. And so then they think, well, I'm watching this pornography and this is how this woman is being treated and she seems to enjoy it. And so I'm going to treat women like that. But he doesn't have a man in his life to show him how to treat a woman and how to deal with a woman. And so you have a lot of conflict. You have men that won't commit. You have men that won't get married. You have men that don't get jobs. The other issue is that a lot of men are just led by women, raised in single-parent families, no men in the church. A lot of churches just don't have a lot of men. Statistically, women are more likely to attend church than men. A lot of men go to church and they hear God sung about as a lover, not as who he is in his masculine nature. They see this image and it says to them, well, this relationship with Christ, this is for women. This is not for me, because I don't see other men following Christ and I don't have good examples in my life. But there's an emptiness in their life. There's a hole, and there's a desire for all men and all women to have a mother in their life and a father in their life, but the men are the ones that are more likely to be missing and to be absent.
Well, that goes right along with the fatherlessness in society as a whole, right? So how did you discover this as a pastor? You obviously came upon it, and you're one of the first people that I remember that actually were talking about the wounds of a man's life. So how did you discover it?
I came to the realization over the last few years. I've been a lot of years of ministry are behind that. And I just noticed there were certain men who couldn't receive any correction. They were hungry for affirmation, but you could never affirm them enough. You could never praise them enough. And the relationship would always wind up going sideways, because there always comes that point when you're in a relationship with an older man, or you're in a mentoring relationship, or as we say in the church, in a discipling relationship, when there needs to be some correction or advice. And I find that so many men just can't receive it. They don't have the capacity. And I just thought for so long, what is it about this why does this guy take correction? Why is he not always blaming everybody for his problems? Why can he maintain a relationship with a woman, keep a job? But then you have this other group of men over here, and now I think it might be the majority of society. I don't think it's a majority of men in the church, not men in my church. That's my experience, but maybe it's higher in other churches. But there's a large percentage of men in the church that just cannot receive correction. They bounce from church to church. Or there might be men who try to maintain a relationship with Christ, but they're not in the church. You and I both know that. There are a lot of people who don't go to church anymore. One of the things about my family growing up, my parents would always drop us kids off at Sunday school. And one day I asked, why don't you guys go to Sunday school? And my mother said, well, we went one time when we first got saved, and the teacher called on your dad, and he was embarrassed, and we never went back again. So that kind of insecurity. My father had insecurity in his life. He had wounds in his life. My grandfather, from what I know, he died many years before I was even born, was a very strong and abusive man, no love, cheated on his wife. That was the example that my father had. He didn't have a godly man in his life to set an example. And he did the best that he could. He was a hard-working guy, and he did tell us kids that he loved us. But I found that there were wounds in my life. There were insecurities in my life. And I think I'm still dealing with it. We never get to that point of perfection. But I have men in my life that will hold me accountable. And I have men in my life still to this day. I just turned 56. I still have men in my life that I consider mentors and disciplers.
I can attest to the fact that I grew up in a single-parented home, which is a female-led, and I did not have a relationship with my father until I was well into my 20s. So I grew up with a big hole in my heart. I really didn't know how to treat a woman. I didn't know any of those things. I never saw it. It never was modeled. So it brought a lot of pain in my life and a lot of learning experiences that were not the best. So in your estimation, you're looking across, you've done years and years of ministry. What percentage of men do you think are really wounded? I mean, if you just, cartoon it, but what do you think is the percentage?
I'd say 20, 25%.
You think that it's that high, huh?
Oh, yeah. I think I might be lowballing it.
Okay.
And again, I'm going off of my church's experience. Mm-hmm. We put a lot of emphasis on men, and we put a lot of emphasis on their roles. I just did a whole retreat. That's why I wanted to get back into the podcast and talk about the issue of men and their woundedness, because we just did a whole retreat on this subject. And the response was interesting. I know guys pretty well in the church, and I realize this guy is wounded or this guy is not. And some are really hungry for it, and some, by their actions, are resistant. Leave the retreat early or kind of stay aloof, don't talk to other guys, move in and out of their discussion times quickly. It's uncomfortable for us because it brings us to a point of vulnerability and insecurity. And as men, we're very uncomfortable with that. Mm-hmm. I keep seeing this over and over again where men will come into the church, and if they have this wound, and it's more often the men that don't have the father in their life or haven't had the father in life, or if he is, he's dysfunctional. He doesn't know how to be a father, and so they carry those wounds into the next generation. I love to use this example. Abraham has to go down to Egypt in a time of famine, and he lies about his wife Sarah because he thinks they're going to kill him and take his wife. And then you see in the next generation, Isaiah goes down to Egypt in a time of famine, and he lies about his wife because he's worried about them killing him and taking his wife. And then you get to the third generation, and the lie is full-blown. You have Jacob, whose name is actually Deceiver. So that lie, that pattern doesn't go away. It intensifies. And then Jacob makes 12 sons, and the majority of them are liars and deceivers. So the pattern keeps going, and that pattern has to be broken. And it can only be broken, like anything in our lives, through the power of Jesus Christ. And then restoring the image of God on us. That's what Jesus came to do. That's the hope of the gospel. That's the appeal of the gospel to men, that we don't have to be the same. Jesus Christ came to restore the image of God in our life.
So do you have the men identify whether they are or not, or identify the wound, or how do you minister to them? How do you get them to a point of wholeness or healing? And it may be a process, but where do you start?
Well, it is a process, and the first point is to, like any problem, acknowledge that you have a problem. And it's not that I sit with men and try to bring them to tears and brokenness, but slowly over time, there has to be a realization as we talk and converse about these various subjects. And I know that I have seen in my life that men who have experienced healing will naturally want to pass that healing on to others. And so if they're really healed, they're going to gather other men around them, usually younger men, and talk to them about their experience and see from my life. Jesus was at least a big brother, if not a father figure to these men. These men were in their, at the oldest, late teens. Jesus is 30 when he begins his ministry. And of course, life expectancy was much shorter back then, so people had to grow up a lot faster. But they saw a healthy man in Jesus. And that's really the process, is bringing them into alignment with what is biblical manhood. And it's very simple in my estimation, my experience, that men just need to be told what to do. We are built and designed to receive instructions and to obey those instructions.
And that's not our culture at all.
Not at all.
Pastor Walt, I think you've heard this criticism that the church is generally run by females. I mean, even if they're not in leadership, they still seem to run the organization. It isn't for men. I mean, that's what a lot of men will say, well, it's just too feminine, it's just for my wife or whatever. I mean, how do you combat that?
You got to develop strong men. Here's what I've done just recently. This is brand new. When I brought my assistant on staff, I gave him 5 areas he could choose out of, 3 responsibilities. And one of them was men's ministry, and he chose that. And I realized I'd given him too much to do, and I also realized that that's my passion. So I took it back from him. And now I have a once-a-month men's get-together, and the idea is bring guys who don't know the Lord to that event. So we go paintballing or bowling or whatever it is. I did a retreat in June, I'm doing one again already in August because the response was so overwhelmingly positive of this retreat about woundedness. I got bombarded with questions on the way back. Well, how do I talk to a woman? How do I ask a girl out? How do I treat my wife? So they have to be introduced to other men who are following Christ, which is exactly what happened with Jesus. Andrew is following Jesus. He goes back and gets his brother, hey, I found the Messiah. Come here and join, which is it seems like an old-fashioned way of evangelizing, but that's evangelism, is inviting people to follow Christ with you. You have to address tough subjects. You have to talk about sex, pornography. We don't talk about those things in the pulpit. We also have to have space for men to talk about those issues because he never talk about them in front of his wife. Mm-hmm. Here's one thing that happens occasionally. Couples will ask me, can we come to you for counseling? The next thing, the wife is in my office berating her husband in front of me because of his pornography addiction. Nothing ever came into the light. It's all remained in the darkness. And then this is how it's exposed. But I want to provide an environment where men can talk about these things. I take men out to lunch all the time. Just my whole life is spending time with men. And that's why I said this is really my passion.
So I know you, and you're a no-nonsense guy. I mean, when you preach, you're no nonsense. You don't hide things. You make things very clear. So would you address something like pornography? Not necessarily the theme, but just say to the congregation, look, there are sins among us in homes, in marriages, and one of them, men, is pornography. Would you do that?
You know me pretty well. You think I would?
Yeah, I think you would. But you had said we don't do that from the pulpit, but it seemed like it was out of context for you because I think you do. And it's not that you're going to do a ministry on pornography on Sunday morning, but you do address it so that people know that, hey, this is wrong, and I know it's wrong, and you know it's wrong, and if you need help, come to the retreat or whatever you have planned.
Absolutely, yes. And we have to talk about these issues, homosexuality, transgenderism, the whole litany of whatever people are exploring.
Right.
It's interesting because you and I, we were just talking before the podcast about a school where I'm in touch with, and the transgenderism is becoming a problem among young women.
And this is a Christian school, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's important to mention because we know that's happening in the public schools, but Christian? Whoa.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it's in every Christian school now. But it's manifesting itself more among the young girls than it is among the boys. And maybe that's just because the boys are less reluctant to talk about it and kind of come out, as they say. But again, that goes back to the father. Where is the father in that life to address what is this issue going on? And I do not believe that people's sexual identity is in their genes or their chromosomes. It is something happens in our life where we cannot, again, the use of the word identity, we cannot identify properly with our own sex. And so things get distorted in our life. Young girls are needing attention and love, and they don't get it from the father, and so things get fairly twisted. But we have to fearlessly address these things. We have a new couple. They've been in the church for about 6 months, and the husband came to me after church. He says, boy, you've got to be the bravest or the craziest person I've ever met in my life, because you're not afraid to touch these issues. And that's why we're here at this church, because we searched for a church where they would touch these kind of hot topics. Here's another thing that I've noticed in my ministry. A couple comes to the church and the husband loves the church, really loves the church. And the reason he loves it is because there's other men, and there are these difficult subjects are being tackled. And then the wife doesn't connect. She doesn't like the church. She doesn't like that. And then they'll inevitably wind up leaving the church. It's delicate because City View can come across as chauvinistic. It can come across as belittling women, because the message of our culture is that women are the ones who are not doing well. But statistically, it is absolutely the opposite. 2/3 of college graduates are women. In some cases, it's even more distorted in some universities. And what are they hearing? They're hearing about gender studies. They're talking about sexuality, those kinds of subjects. And men are just, there's no place for them in the culture. My assistant pastor did a retreat a couple of years ago, and the title of the retreat was Free to Be Men. And let's just create an environment where men can just be free all weekend.
Well, I think that's what Coach McCartney actually ended up doing with Promise Keepers initially, and had a great response. And I think people, now they may not have termed it as woundedness, but that's really what they were dealing with men. And I went to several of them and had great conversations with men going to and from and during. And it was a lot about, the pain in my life as a male. And who do you talk to? Males are, they're not like women in the sense that they have this conversation, an ongoing conversation with someone. They just don't share. Most men don't have close relationships at all. And that is a problem, because we are still built as emotional beings. We need relationships, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And that's really the key, is getting men, when you begin to talk about these subjects and you get them to start opening up, what I find is men go deeper faster than women. Women will stay on the surface forever. But if you can get a man to open up and you can get through that hard shell that he's developed over his heart, there's a fountain of sharing there. And there's a release that happens. And when you get men talking and you get them opening up, you have to teach them then to pursue relationships with other men. That's the key. That
is the key. I got to tell you a quick story about one of your elders. This elder was in my living room, and my niece shows up, newly married woman, and he asks her, now this elder is quite old, he's in his late 70s, right? And he says, well, does your husband open the car door for you? And she laughs and goes, are you kidding? And he said, well, he should, because that's honor. That's showing you honor. And I just kind of looked at him, and they had a connection going on. But you know what happened? I got the message, and I started opening the door, the car door for my wife. I've done it ever since. She looks at me and says, what did you do with my husband?
Yeah.
I mean, she lights up. She goes, whoa, where did that come from? I've never really told her, but it came from that elder simply having a conversation. So you're right. Men need to be told.
And I hear that from the wives. If the wife is willing, she's got to make a few changes herself and learn patience with this guy and give him another chance. But I've heard this from women. What'd you do with my husband? He's totally changed. He's leading spiritually. He's getting the kids up for church, all of those kinds of things. But again, until that wound is dealt with, we're not going to see that kind of behavior out of men. He's got to humble himself. He's got to realize and acknowledge, yeah, I got wounds in my life. I got hurts in my life. And so often men just run away. They'll just leave the church. That's the sad part. But that doesn't mean that we stop reaching out and trying to heal the brokenness in our world.
So obviously this podcast goes out to a variety of people, both in your church and on the internet. So if people are listening, men are listening particularly, because we're going to do a series on this. This is episode 1, but we're going to do many. We're going to investigate this more as weeks go on. But if they're interested in saying, okay, I'm going to investigate this man stuff or this retreat stuff, how do they get in contact with you or the church, and what's the process?
Oh, well, they could go to our website, cvcmpls.org, City View Church, and we're just located in South Minneapolis. But listen to the podcast and prepare for more. And you know me, I'll speak clearly over the next few sessions. But in the meantime, wherever men are at, they have to have the boldness to go to other men and say, I want to go deeper with you. That is the most important thing to me, is to find a man in your life, preferably an older man, and go to him and say, I need help. I need help in my marriage. I need to figure this woman out, which is impossible, right? But I need some help figuring this woman out, and I need to figure out my life and who I am, and ask for that. And at the end of the retreat that I just did, I asked all the older men, how many of you looking around this room would love the opportunity to mentor other younger men, and you would be open any time of the day or evening for a phone call or text asking you questions about relationship? Every man was like, absolutely. They're enthusiastically saying, yes, 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 come to us. So the men are out there, and I believe they're in our churches, and it's probably the sleeping giant. If we get the men to wake up, things will heal in the church.
We are bringing a bold statement about Christ. He's our only hope to face the darkness in our day. Thanks for joining us for the CitySites Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. Every Friday, we bring you this podcast with interviews with people who are challenging the status quo of Christianity and challenging the cultural norms of our day. Please help us get the word out by sharing the link to this podcast with your online friends and family. Our website also contains other podcasters who are part of the CitySites network of communicators, all sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Our website is citysitesurbanmedia.com.
This is the CitySites Podcast Network.